sectors that affect the base of the pyramid for Latin America: education, health, fintech. We've started particularly working on education. We're also the creators of Edu for Me, the largest EdTech event in Latin America. We've been in Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and soon to be in Mexico, and we're back in Buenos Aires now in October. What we do is bring the community of education technology together, and we build companies and solutions using the potential of technology to change how education is done and the reach of education in the region.
I'm Juan Pablo Capello. I'm from Chile. No one's perfect. Been trying to make up for that. I was a partner in Patagon, which was either a great success or a great failure if you were a buyer or a seller of the company. We sold the company to Banco Santander in 2000 for about $700 million. And since then, I'm an investor in about 30 early stage companies. I'm a partner in a company builder in Los Angeles named Mob Labs, where we build mobile products. And I have a 10,000 square foot co-working space in Miami.
Okay, so welcome everyone. So we have mostly Chile and Argentina, so a bit of a bias in terms of Latam. And we have people from corporations involved in accelerators, entrepreneurs, investors. So I think it's a very interesting panel. First question I would like to make is that we talk about Latin America like it would be a common market and it would be the same thing. So could you highlight what are the main differences you find in the different countries in Latin America, especially on the startup, on the digital economy perspective? We have seen a lot of things going on lately, especially Brazil was booming, now is declining again. Mexico suddenly is attracting a lot of VCs. Chile has become quite stable for the last years. Could you give your perspective of what is the differentiation of each market? Who wants to start? Maybe Wayra, you have a very good overview of the different countries.
Yeah. ¿Soy yo? ¿Sí? Well, actually, with Wayra, since we have physical presence in those 7 countries, what we see is a very diverse ecosystem. I mean, I'm used to hear that Latin America is one huge market, which is not. And hola, ¿sí? Ahí estoy bien. Okay, so I'm used to hear that Latin America is one huge market, which is not. Brazil, it's booming, but they are really, really close. I mean, they don't want to grow outside their borders, and they don't. I mean, if you are from outside Brazil, getting into that market, it's really hard. Mexico, it's a nice market, but it's quite fragmented, and they don't usually look at Spain or the rest of Latin America. They are looking more to get into the States through LA or through San Francisco. And then there's differences in the sophistication of the ecosystems. I mean, you can't compare Chile with all these law-abiding citizens with some other countries where have difference in politics and problems with their currency and no stability in their countries. So it's a nice market, but it's not a single market as everyone thinks to.
Okay.
So at risk of sounding repetitive, but yes, it's definitely not a single market. You have a country like Brazil, which is, in terms of size of market, is the only market that really can support quite large businesses on its own. And although the market is going through a crisis right now, or an economic crisis, the tech sector is still growing. And that's what I've heard actually last week from a lot of the investors in Brazil. But you have a situation where the ecosystem is rationalizing and valuations are rationalizing, and that's actually something good. So it's a good time to if you're not risk adverse, to invest in Brazil and wait for the cycle. In terms of the rest of Latin America, the ecosystems have different stages of development. For some strange reason, you find a very developed ecosystem in Argentina with good quality entrepreneurs, although the market is honestly not there and doesn't accompany them. Other countries like Chile have institutionally probably the best market, although the market size is not necessarily the one you're looking for. Places like Colombia have been becoming really interesting, and there's been a lot more activity, more entrepreneurs dedicated to technology and creating new projects and new products, and a lot of investors have been looking at that market. For some strange reason, Mexico, although being close to the US, has been an ecosystem that has been struggling and has its difficulties to actually generate the level of activity that will be reasonable for the size of market that Mexico represents. So you have a bit of different situations. Then you can start looking at opportunities or businesses that actually develop on the Spanish side of Latin America, and then looking at Brazil as a completely different animal and taking the precautions in how to enter into that market.
Yeah, from my perspective, what the ecosystem in Latin America has, all the countries have in common is you have more money coming in every year into the tech sector than coming out. And my personal view is that that's not sustainable in the medium or long term. I mean, you can't have an ecosystem where every year, 3 times as much money is going in that investors are getting back. What's been interesting in Latin America is that, you've had Brazil, which attracted for 2 or 3 years Silicon Valley's interest, and you had a number of Silicon Valley funds.
Can you comment a bit? Why do you think Sequoia went away from Brazil?
Well, that's what I'm getting to. I mean,
Sorry.
They came into Brazil for 2 or 3 years, and a number of those funds actually have left Brazil. And what you've really seen in Latin America, which for me is great, is the development of a sort of a techno-Latino, where you have an ecosystem that occasionally you have some companies that are able to raise money and build outside of Latin America. But the reality is 90%, 95% of the companies in Latin America are funded primarily by local capital, by the good work of Wayra, Startup Chile, Impulsa in Colombia, etc. And they're companies that outside of Brazil have to regionalize right away because their local markets individually aren't probably large enough to support having a sustainable company. So companies very quickly are operating in 3, 4, 5, 6 markets. Most entrepreneurs in Latin America, after hitting their head against the wall, trying to raise money in Silicon Valley, end up realizing that they're really, hoping to be a local star. And the people who have, most of the entrepreneurs who have survived the last 4 or 5 years have adopted that mentality. So, from my perspective, I'm very proud about what's gone on in Latin America in the last 5 years, but I'm very, very concerned that we continue to have an ecosystem where every year more money's going in, that investors are getting out, and I'm just not sure how long that dynamic is sustainable.
Like I mentioned before, I was part of Startup Chile, and while I don't have such specific knowledge of the ecosystem in Argentina and other areas of Latin America, in contrast from what I saw in Chile, or some of the highlights and lowlights that I saw in Chile is, it did feel like a place that is still making a really strong bet on developing an ecosystem, even in ways that seem a little forced, right? By bringing in capital and just something will come out, even if some of the startups are not at the level of maturity to get that capital. There was a lot of fixation with, exactly what just was brought up. Having success stories, having, a few companies that will bring in money to pay for all the investments in companies that have failed. And in Chile, there's, Patagon and Mercado Libre and other success stories in Latin America, but in Chile there was, at the time, a few were coming through, but a fixation with finding a unicorn, a huge business that will sort of validate the entire system, and that wasn't really coming through. And the other thing that I found is there seemed to be a little bit of a gap, right? It's sort of easy to get funded at a very early stage with a program like Startup Chile and others, but then because there wasn't that validation of the system, some of the investors seemed reluctant and were not as risk adverse as we find in Silicon Valley. And also the companies were not mature enough and not global enough to raise money in Silicon Valley. We have the experience of going with a bunch of the startups that were successful in Startup Chile. We went out to Silicon Valley and tried to raise money there, but obviously we did it, just went for 10 days and hoped somebody, write a check for $1 million in 10 days, and that didn't quite happen. But the overwhelming message was, go back home, raise some money, get established, think globally, and come back when you need a bigger check, but you're a little more established.
Okay. Talking about, we've been Mercado Libre, Peixe Urbano, Compare Online. There's a few good success stories on the digital tech. But we have, in the last years, not much has happened in terms of IPOs and exits in the Latin American. What is happening in terms of who are the next thing, and what is the model that you think is going to prevail? Is there enough disruptive innovation at the local level, or is more the rocket internet model that's going to prevail? And so what you see as going to be the next wave, especially because most of the digital tech startups, need a lot of money. You were talking about there's a lot of money coming in, but most of the startups that are going to the Latin America, they really spend a lot of money. So what do you see in the next years in terms of?
I think that in the last few years we saw interesting things. There's this stupid fixation with the unicorns and this stupid fixation on Silicon Valley and this third stupid fixation on raising tens of millions of dollars in the region. However, there were a lot of good things happening. If you look at how Naspers, for instance, started growing a media company in Brazil, how people like Monashis or Kasek are establishing huge funds, people like Globant are IPOing in the States. You start looking at things that are interesting enough. The region is growing. However, there are other things that are not as good as
But you see more local innovation, and you see more
yeah,
company from outside,
no, I mean,
and rocket internet.
I don't see that companies are becoming global from Latin America at the pace that we were expecting. However, I think that within the next few years, the ecosystem will grow companies that will become global. I mean, we have all the resources and the market, and some markets are growing, as Gabriela said, with Colombia or Mexico even, or even Argentina. Within all its crises, they are growing good companies. But the problem is that the landscape, it's becoming more competitive, and funds don't have a good deal flow of companies to invest. So if you're a fund that invests in B rounds or maybe A rounds, you don't have deal flow because you have a lot of small companies trying to get into the market, but you don't have companies that grows within the region. They don't know how to internationalize itself. And what you are starting to see is that companies like Naspers on one side, or maybe Rocket Internet, are growing within Brazil and taking advantage of their deep pockets. They are getting into small countries or small markets, not small countries. I don't want to mean that there are small countries, but there are small markets like Peru, for instance, and they start buying companies before they start reaching critical mass to grow. So this is something that we will see. We will see a fight between huge groups, and but I think that we will start seeing companies that are not unicorns, a term that I hate, but we are seeing good things happening.
If you see in Latin America, and not so long ago, last year, MIT did a study of all the investment ecosystem in Latin America, looking at the different funds and different stages of investment and kind of companies. You had the phase of the straightforward copycats. You had the phase of the adapted copycats, which were still pretty much in as a region. And then you come into the phase of real local innovation that resolves local issues. Again, if the markets are not big enough, that those local issues may or may not be such a big business. I think the fact that investors came, like Sequoia, came looking for unicorns is not necessarily the place. You know, a few might emerge, but it's not what the ecosystem should be looking for. The majority of the activity in M&A in Latin America happens on trade sales, and the numbers of those transactions are still not public, so we don't really know. But some of the funds are having small exits, and also another problem is because of the lack of exits, entrepreneurs, when they get one offer or maybe a second offer, they go for it before escalating their business because they are afraid that they won't get another offer. So you end up having the cycle ends up being a lot shorter. It's not 7 to 10 years. It's actually more 3 to 5, or between the 3 and 7 at the most. So that changes, and that has to do with the maturity of the market and how that will evolve. It will depend on how strong the ecosystem is, and that we understand the differences that the market in Latin America has. Latin America doesn't have strong capital markets, and in this day and age, if it didn't happen, I don't think we will have strong capital markets. So therefore, you know, different structures of funding that exist in the US to get really large funds, I'm not sure it would be the case. The multiples are just not there. But that doesn't mean that you cannot create innovation, that you cannot do different things, and that you cannot do good deals with nice multiples that make good business.
I wanted to mention something. All the panelists, I feel like at some point have mentioned the lack of companies that think globally right away in the region. And I feel like that's something that as a culture we share, Spain and Latin America, is, you know, we're not wired naturally to think globally of our business. It's almost like you gotta get over a certain complex, you know, and you think regionally first. I run a global business, but it really took me a while to think that my business could be global, and it was very obvious and very right in front of me, and I still had this, for some reason, desire of making it almost local, and then national, and then eventually global, but that mindset wasn't there naturally, and I was privileged to be in San Francisco and surrounded by people that were like, well, duh, you know, and then that influenced me. And then the other thing is, you know, I feel like there's such a disparity of incomes and inequality in many regions of Latin America that thinking big for many entrepreneurs may be very different than it would be for Mark Zuckerberg or someone like that to think big, because they're already middle class and going to Harvard, or, you know, middle high class. And so $1 million is not that much money, where for a lot of entrepreneurs in Latin America, making $1 million is a lot of money already. So I think those two things are very sort of wire in some of the mentality of entrepreneurs in Latin America. And it's not that easy to make that connection that yes, I can build a $100 million business and globally, and that doesn't happen naturally. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, Gabby, from my perspective, made a very important point, which ties into the demographic shift in terms of internet usage in Latin America. When we launched Patagon in '97, there was only 15 million internet users in all of Latin America. The growth has been about close to 2,000% since then. It's actually after Africa, the region which has had the fastest internet growth. It's actually outpaced on a percentage basis Asia. We have over 350 million internet users. And as we just heard, the point is that those internet users are quite different than internet users, say, in the US, where Latin America actually has now more internet traffic than the United States. The internet users in Latin America are almost all mobile first. And a lot of those people, you have about 150 million people which are coming online in about a 3-year window, which is fairly dramatic. And it's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And the second thing you got to understand about those internet users is they have an annual income, average annual income of about $10,000. The average internet user in the United States has an average annual income of $50,000. So, going to Gabby's point, or Mariano's point about sort of copycats and adaptive copycats, my view is one big problem in Latin America is that, for a long time we had sort of the elites creating tech companies inspired by, I don't know, Wired magazine or TechCrunch or whatever the latest fad in Silicon Valley was, and they weren't really building companies that were very relevant to these 150, 200 million people who were coming online for the first time. And so for me, the big opportunity for the ecosystem is to build companies that will address the needs of those new consumers. And if we do that, we have a tremendous opportunity in hand, and certainly the ability to build lots of $100 million plus kinds of companies.
Thank you. So you talked about...
Sorry, and one other thing, and that's why in Latin America, to the point that Juan Pablo is making, when we solve issues that affect the base of the pyramid, we're actually enabling consumers in a way that it has never been done before. And technology can certainly be a game changer in that. But if we look only at the top of the pyramid, we're not going to make a significant change.
Yeah, interesting. So my next question is about, you talked about thinking global from day one in Latin America. So my question is about, there's this maybe stupid idea as well, that there's a big link, a special link between Portugal and Spain and the Latin America, and that the natural market for expansion for Spanish and Portuguese and European companies can be the Latin American and vice versa. Is this a stupid idea, or what we're seeing, or is there really a link, or companies in Latin America, when they think global, they think US or Asia or something else? Or if it's the case of being a link, what is the advice you give for European startups going to the Latin American?
No, I don't think that. I mean, I think that this is not one of the stupid ideas I mentioned before. The link between Spain and Portugal with Latin America, it's really clear, despite the fact that because we speak Spanish or Portuguese, we are not the same. I mean, I'm sure that people here will realize that I'm from Argentina if I start speaking in Espanol, which I'm sure they will say that I am not speaking Espanol, but Argentino. But one of the problems is that the cultural differences between the countries. For instance, this thinking global stuff that he was talking about, or that Juan Pablo was talking about, I think it really differs from country to country. If you go to Argentina, when you start realizing which startups had some sort of success, or they have become companies of more than 1 billion, or they are IPO'd, you start realizing that Argentinian people had like 5 from the 6 that went through that way. And that's because you realize that your market it's small, it's unstable, and you try to get out and try to build something global, because this is the only way to create a sustainable business. When you go to Brazil, you realize that people from Brazil usually don't think going outside Brazil, because they have one market that it's bigger than the rest of Latin America, and it's way bigger than Spain.
But in Argentina, when they think about going global, if they think about Europe and the link to Spain, or that's the fantasy, and they think US and whatever.
They start thinking, I mean, for what I see, they start thinking in Latin America and maybe Spain, maybe. I mean, they don't. I think that at some point we lost the link between Spain and Latin America. I think at some point Spain had the chance to become the bridge between Europe and Latin America and help companies grow global. I remember being here in 2008 or maybe 2009 in a startup conference, and I was arguing with one VC, one huge VC from Spain, that he doesn't, when he started internationalizing their investments, they wasn't thinking in Latin America. They was thinking in going to the rest of Europe, even Eastern Europe, because they thought, oh, the euro it's a good and hard currency, instead of going to Latin America. So at some point I think that Spain lose one battle. They have the chance still to become the bridge between Latin America and Europe, but I think Miami and Colombia are pushing hard against Madrid or Spain.
You want to comment on that?
Do you want to go ahead?
I don't have a really strong view. I mean, it's very clear that for Spanish companies that want to grow, Latin America is a fast-growing market, just in terms of internet growth, et cetera. Europe in general, and Spain in particular, is a very saturated market where you have between 80 and 90% internet penetration. At Latin America, we still, we have about 350 million people online of a market of 600 million, and it'll probably top out about 525 million. So we still have another 5, 6, 7, 8 years of growth in Latin America, and so it's a growing dynamic market. And if I'm running, I'm a founder of several companies that are regionally operate in Latin America, and my view is that Latin American companies should sort of stick to their knitting and focus on being very strong regional businesses, rather than thinking. I mean, there'll be a few exceptions, but in general, we'd say in Spanish, es delirio de grandeza. It's sort of a fool's errand to try to think that you have to go out and conquer the world when you're in the second fastest growing region in terms of internet usage in the next 5 years in the whole world. Asia being number 1, Latin America being number 2, and Africa being number 3. So there's a huge opportunity in Latin America for people who understand and know the region.
And the U.S., being in Miami?
Yeah, well, I'm a big supporter of the Miami ecosystem. Miami, I mean, it's very clear because of the fact that Silicon Valley is so focused on unicorns, mainly because 95% of the Silicon Valley funds have a negative return, and they're all hoping to make it back by getting in one big deal. And when they realize that one big deal is very, very, very unlikely to happen in Latin America, they don't focus at all on the region. And so in Miami, we've sort of felt that if we can build a local tech ecosystem that's really a gateway between Latin America and the United States, that can be very, very, very interesting and beneficial, particularly because, the big joke or big joke about Miami is its proximity to the United States, because you have a city that's 2.8 million people, and it's 2.2 million Hispanics. 2.2 million Hispanics out of 2.8 million people. So it really is a de facto Latin American city, but with a lot of the access and reach into the U.S. market.
What I see is that Latin American companies, when they think of expanding, they naturally think outside of Latin America. They naturally think the U.S. and Miami being a good gateway. For one reason is that you have proficient consumers that they can learn a lot from, which is U.S. Hispanics. And that not only thinking of Miami, but in the States in general, it represents a market of 60 million people, and that are looking and have ties to the region one way or another. They're more proficient consumers, and as Juan Pablo said, they have access to different things. In terms of Europe, the distance, it's a lot greater, not only in actual distance, but working with the time difference, the time zones, and different things. If they look at that, they might as well make the leap to a further away market like Asia because of its potential and its growth and its development. Europe has not shown growth rates that are that attractive to some entrepreneurs or to most entrepreneurs, and the effort of coming into new markets, adjusting to new cultures and everything might have not been that attractive so far. Nonetheless, there are companies that have expanded to Spain and Portugal because of the ease of language, but that doesn't necessarily mean the market is easier. I've seen more things go the other way of Spanish companies expanding into Latin America, where you come from a developed market, you have different practices, but again, you need to be become sort of bulletproof in a lot of ways to do business in Latin America, because let's face it, we have subsequent crises, one after the other one, rules changing constantly. So you need to become very resilient and very dynamic if you want to do business in Latin America and know the market.
Yeah, I agree. I have friends that are entrepreneurs in Latin America and Spain. Then I'm a Spanish entrepreneur, and I feel like for a Spanish entrepreneur going to Latin America at the high-tech level and the other way around, many times it's an afterthought. And I think at some point, like Mariano said, there was this special relationship, and at some point the link was lost. And I think it was a loss on the Spain side, because at some point Spain had the upper hand to sort of reinvent the relationship to make it mutually beneficial at a time where Latin America was starting to grow dramatically, and it just didn't have the vision to reinvent that relationship. And I feel like Latin America has found other, faster, more creative partners in that development. And so it's a shame, but it does feel that way, that it's an afterthought. And I think it's mainly a lost opportunity for Spain, because the perception of Latin America and other regions of Europe is kind of the empire in decline and slow growth. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's 0, just finished right on time, so I'm very proud of the moderation. So thank you very much for your comments. No time for questions, but we'll be around, so if you have any questions, please approach the speakers. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.